Now let me tell you something, nerds. This is Nerd Bomber vs. Movies, the show where two movies fight and we pick a winner. I'm just Jamie and I'm here with
your friend Claude.
And we got a fight for you today. There's gonna be sweat, there's gonna be tears, there may even be blood. You may have guessed it, but today we're talking about two movies starring famous professional wrestlers. But we're not talking about Hulk Hogan, brother. We're not even talking about John Cena. I don't want to see him. And we're not talking about The Rock. I don't smell nothing. No, we got some others in mind. Dig it? Tell them, Claude.
What you need to realize is that wrestlers have a rich history of making the jump to movies, dude. And we're starting off with the OG of the big screen bruisers. None other than the hot rod himself, Roddy Piper, as he makes his debut action role in Hell Comes to Frogtown, a nice little mutant movie. And he faces some stiff competition against the latter-day pugilist turned movie star Dave Bautista in the Netflix zombie flick Army of the Dead. Ain't that right, Jimmy?
That sure is. And when we come back, we're gonna give you some basics. So stick around. Oh yeah!
Woo!
All right, like I said, we're back. That's much better. Let's try this again. As you just heard, on today's show, we're going to be stepping into the squared circle to discuss a couple of films starring former pro wrestlers. These wrestlers and these movies are from very different eras with vastly different budgets, but they have some very similar plot points, which is really what brings them together for our show. They're both about a character played by a wrestler leading a team across the boundaries of a non-human society. So what are these movies? They are 1988's Hell Comes to Frogtown, starring Roddy Piper, and 2021's Army of the Dead, starring Batista or Dave Bautista. Now, you may have noticed we're trying something new today, and I'm not talking about cutting wrestling promos. I am here with you, and we will cover the basics, and then later Claude will join you for the tale of the tape, as we usually do, and then at the end we will reconvene and we'll talk about our scoring. All right, here we go with the basics. Now, this may take a little longer than usual, so settle in. We'll start with Hell Comes to Frogtown. So again, this movie came out in 1988. It was written by Donald G. Jackson and Randall Frakes. Frakes is kind of a utility man in Hollywood sci-fi. He's been involved with many productions such as Escape from New York, Terminator, Terminator 2, Aliens, many others. In addition to screenwriting, he has worked on different films adapting novelizations and doing synthesizer effects, photographic effects, set design, pretty much anything under the sun. As I mentioned, Frakes wrote this movie with Donald G. Jackson. Jackson gets directing credit here, his main contribution to film being this movie and its sequels, and a franchise of films called The Rollerblade 7, and a lot of other obscure films as well. A lot of these movies being done as vanity projects for Z-level movie weirdo Scott Shaw. Also listed as a director is R.J. Kaiser, who was brought in due to creative differences between the studio and Jackson. Kaiser worked almost exclusively as a sound editor before he worked on this film. Jackson and Frakes, by the way, are also producers here with music by David Shapiro, who is most known for working in the music departments for Charlie Rose for nearly 30 years. Okay, the cast. First up, it's obviously none other than the late Roddy Piper as the amazingly named Sam Hell, one of the few fertile men left on a post-apocalyptic world captured by the government and tasked with rescuing and impregnating a group of women, themselves captured by the leaders of the Mutant Frog Society. You heard all that right. I have a lot to say about Piper here, but I'll try to keep it short. Obviously, he came into acting from the world of professional wrestling. He became a household name as a rival to Hulk Hogan in the early days of the former WWF's national presence and their pay-per-views, especially the early WrestleManias. Now, this isn't the place for a crash course in wrestling history, but Piper had been an active wrestler before all that happened, having come up working in what is now known as the territory days, before the WWF, now the WWE, went nationwide and international in the mid to late 80s. In terms of acting, Piper had an extensive career. Hulk Hogan often gets the credit as the first wrestler to break through in major motion pictures and sitcoms, and modern stars like The Rock and John Cena and Batista now appear in A-level productions. But Piper has nearly as many actual acting credits to his name as the rest of them combined. Although most of these were single episode appearances of TV shows and B-movies. He is most well known in acting for starring in John Carpenter's classic They Live, and later in life as a recurring character on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. All right. Next up in the cast is Sandal Bergman as Spangle, a government scientist tasked with watching over Sam, making sure he does his procreative duties. Bergman is best known as Valeria in Conan the Barbarian. She worked through to the early 2000s, mostly TV episodes of things like Hard Times and Planet Earth and Swamp Thing, and a lot of B-level sci-fi and horror movies like Red Sonja and She. Next up is Sek Varel. She plays Sentinella, the quiet military escort for Hell and Spangle. Varel was primarily a TV actor, making many appearances over the years in such shows as NYPD Blue, Murder, She Wrote, The X-Files, LA Law, and a whole lot of others. And then rounding out the main cast is William Smith as Count Sodom / Captain Devlin, a military leader selling weapons to the Frog Society, and Rory Calhoun as Looney Tunes, a crazy old miner prospector character who helps Sam once he gets to Frogtown. Nicholas Worth, in heavy prosthetics and animatronics, plays Bull, the Frogtown chief, and Christy Summers, also in heavy special effects makeup, plays Arabella, an ally of Sam. There's not a lot of information about the production of this movie to be found. As you'll see later on the big board, it's hard to come by a lot of information about this movie. Basically, the movie was financed on a small budget based on Donald G. Jackson's minor successes and Frakes' writing experience, along with a recommendation from none other than James Cameron, who had worked with both of these guys under B-movie legend Roger Corman, which also tells you how they managed to do some of the creature effects featured in this movie on the small budget that they were given. Piper was pushed onto Jackson and Frakes by the studio. They had imagined more of a motor-mouth comedian type in the role, although there was tension on set due to the studio insisting on casting Piper and bringing in Kaiser as the co-director. Everyone seems to have worked hard to do their best, and everyone involved now considers the film to be somewhat of a success in terms of accomplishing its creative goals. All right, pop culture footprint, not much. In its time, the reviews were bad, and the box office was non-existent, as you'll see. There weren't any comic books, there weren't any regular books, toys, video games. More recently, it has been the subject of homage in Family Guy. There was an inferior sequel called Return to Frogtown, starring Robert Zadar and Lou Ferrigno, and an even inferior movie starring the aforementioned Scott Shaw. The movie has a nominal cult following, and there aren't any rumors of anything really happening with the franchise going forward. Okay, next up, Zack Snyder's Netflix release, Army of the Dead. So obviously Zack Snyder's the director here. Snyder is known, of course, for Watchmen, 300, and the Justice League, the DC movies. In addition to directing, producing, and a story credit, Snyder also gets screenwriting credit along with Shay Hatton and Joby Harold, who between them are also known for several John Wick sequels. Music here is done by Tom Hulkenborg. Not a household name, but it's likely that you've heard his work. He's done scores for movies like Divergent, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Mad Max Fury Road, Deadpool, Alita Battle Angel, Sonic the Hedgehog, and many, many others. So you may not know his name, but you know his music. Alrighty, the cast. We have an ensemble, so this may take a minute. And I might not go into the selected filmography for everyone in this cast for this movie. Leading the way, of course, is another former wrestler, Dave Bautista. The Animal, as he was known when he got his start in wrestling. He got his start in wrestling late, nearly 30 years old when he started training in OVW, that's Ohio Valley Wrestling, which at the time was WWE's developmental program. He would go on to have a successful career in WWE, which included several layoffs in between top-level runs, including as a champion. During these layoffs, he would do smaller parts in movies like The Man with the Iron Fist. His breakout movie role was as Drax in the MCU Guardians of the Galaxy movies, and he also had a small but pivotal and impressive part in Blade Runner 2049. Here he plays near-retirement mercenary Scott Ward, who gets sucked into one last job, leading a team into a zombie-infested Las Vegas to retrieve something for a wealthy benefactor. Joining him are Omari Hardwick, Anna De La Regura, Matthias Schweighofer, Raul Castilla, Samantha Wynn, and Tig Notaro as Vanderho, Maria Cruz, Ludwig Dieter, Mikey Guzman, Chambers, and Marianne Peters, respectively. This compromises Ward's team. Also tagging along are Scott Ward's estranged daughter, Kate, played by Ella Purnell, Underground City smuggler Lily, played by Nora Arnazedar, and abusive security guard Burt Cummings, played by Theo Rossi. Stunt performers Richard Citrone and Athena Parampil are under thick special effects makeup as Zeus and Alpha Queen, two key presences among the zombies. And finally, playing Bly Tanaka, the man who hires Ward for this little infiltration, is played by Hiroyuki Sanada, who is best known for The Last Samurai, Rush Hour 3, and Sunshine, among many others. So this movie spent a long time in development hell. Snyder originally conceived it as a spiritual successor to his 2004 movie Dawn of the Dead, and the project was announced by Warner Brothers as early as 2007, and then nothing happened until Netflix bought the rights in 2019 and placed Snyder in as the auteur, writer, director, producer, cinematographer, etc. Production got underway with a medium budget for a movie of this kind in the current market. Claude will discuss the finances of the production a little later. Despite this medium budget, this is a big special effects extravaganza featuring prosthetics, special effects makeup, practical effects, explosions, CGI, etc. Most of that work was done by Framestore under the leadership of Jacqueline Abrahante. One interesting note about the production is that Tig Notaro filmed all of her scenes on a green screen after production was over and never shared the set with any of her co-stars. This footage was inserted pretty seamlessly into the film to replace Canadian Chris D'Elia, who was removed from the film after being Me Too'd. In terms of pop culture footprint, the film was met with mixed reviews, but by most measures of this new era of media consumption, which Claude will discuss shortly, it was considered a success. It has already spawned a prequel film titled Army of Thieves, and there is a film sequel and an animated show on the way. Whew, all right, that does it for the basics. Next up is Claude with the big board.
Welcome back, fight fans, to tonight's Tale of the Tape. As promised, here I am, along with this fairly sizable board, soon to be full of fun information. Let's start, as we always do, with the distributing studio. A company called New World Pictures for Hell Comes to Frogtown. It's infamous for being associated with about this type of content. Over on the Army of the Dead side, New World goes up against a small-time contender you may or may not have heard of called Netflix. Let's look at the ratings. How do they match up? Well, dead even this time. These are both R-rated films. You get the classical gore and nudity in Hell Comes to Frogtown, and over in Army of the Dead, you get as many exploding zombies as you can shake a detached limb at. Moving down to running time, this is where it separates the men from the patienter men. 88 tight, concise minutes for Hell Comes to Frogtown, and an entire extra hour. 148 minutes for Army of the Dead. Let's look at release dates. January something of 1988 for Hell Comes to Frogtown. And over on Army of the Dead, this is from May 14th of last year, 2021. Usually when release dates are ambiguous, as in the case of Hell Comes to Frogtown, that indicates a lack of a theatrical run. Going down to the budgets, well, Hell Comes to Frogtown was made for a modest budget of $400,000 approximately. And yes, it does show on screen, but at the same time, they get all of their money's worth out of it. If you go over to Army of the Dead, well, they had a little more budget to work with, around $80 million. However, if you look at what these movies made, as we are about to, the story is a little more evenly matched again. There is actually no profit information available for Hell Comes to Frogtown. Neither of us could find it, and you may or may not have to venture into Frogtown yourself if you hope to uncover it. For Army of the Dead, though, since it was released in theaters for about a week before it began streaming on Netflix, it was shown on about 900 and change screens, and in that time it took in only about $1 million. So, not quite the blowout. And since Netflix is notorious for not really sharing their numbers, their viewership, any information that would help you gauge the performance of anything that streams on their platform. But since both movies ended up getting sequels, we can kind of call it a wash. Now it's time to go head to head and see how things shake out in the scoring round.
And we're back together again, and this time we're going to do some individual scoring for the movie. I suppose I should go first.
Why not?
All right, so we'll start with Hell Comes to Frogtown. I give the visuals a 7, I give performances a 5, and I give writing a 6. Now, the visuals I give a 7. That's a pretty high score for a movie that can look pretty rough, but what you have to consider is the limitations of its around about 400,000 budget is what we presume, somewhere between 3 and 5, essentially. They accomplished a lot. Like I said, there are very heavy special effects makeup. There's prosthetics. There's animatronics. They did a lot with that sort of thing. In some other ways, you can tell that's where a lot of the finances went.
Yeah.
Because there are some very bare there is some bare set design happening and a lot of stuff hidden. The background is foggy and it's kind of out of focus with lighting, so you don't necessarily know what's happening 10 feet or 20 feet behind what's happening with the story. But they do a lot, so they get credit for doing what they did without very many resources. So I give a 7 for visuals. Performances, a 5. That's kind of below the mark that we usually think about as good on this show. That's not to say that they are especially bad, that they deserve ridicule, but you have an inexperienced lead in Roddy Piper, and you have other performers that were not known for doing extensive, deep character work.
Right.
Everybody accomplishes their role. And then writing a 6, I give it a little credit here. It hits that 6 mark. The writing is not, the dialogue and the plot there are not extraordinary, but the movie doesn't overstay its welcome. It stays short and concise, and for that, it gets writing credit because it does manage to tell its story, do what it wants to do, and get from beginning to end in a period of time that doesn't make you feel like you're waiting for everything or anything. The movie does not sort of lollygag its way. So it gets a little credit, gets a 6. So again, visual 7, performances 5, writing 6.
Well, mine aren't all that dissimilar, and in some ways, perhaps I was a little more harsh. As you can see, I also scored the visuals a 7, followed by 5 for performances, and an even lower score of 5 as well for writing. Well, for visuals, I pretty much agree with everything you said. It's very, very easy to see in this movie where the money was spent and where it was not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just the nature of working with a constrained budget, and this movie does that right along with the best examples I've seen, really, for what it is. And there's nothing visually impressive, but a score like 7 just reflects the quality of what they were able to achieve within the context of the story for me, and within that context, I was impressed. The heavy focus of that, the big impression it leaves on you is the animatronics and the prosthetics. Some of them are a little more cartoony, and some of them are a little more realistic. But all of them look like they were given care and effort, and not just rushed out as an afterthought. And that kind of goes along with performances as well, because you have to be of a certain caliber to bring those effects to life. And while we're not talking about any major stars here, the people in this film that spent most of their time in those prosthetics and underneath animatronic heads and things like that, they were able to accomplish pretty much everything they needed to emotionally and in terms of their character. And so I think for those performers, there's really nothing to complain about. It's probably more of the unmasked and more simply costumed performers that I would judge more harshly. Mm-hmm. This is basically a B movie, and it shows with some of the casting and some of the character actions. There's at least one in particular where the actress was required to do little more than sit in the same spot and react throughout the movie. So it throws the balance off a little bit. But Roddy Piper coming into really his first kind of lead role in an action vehicle really steps up to the plate. He is obviously from the wrestling world used to being a character, and he brings that to the screen, which translates to a strong performance and a strong character for the film. I think obviously he's the standout performer for me. And everybody else kind of gets the job done. There is a somewhat recognizable name in the cast, William Smith playing the villain. You've seen him all over classic TV shows, and while he has a lot of experience, perhaps the most experience of anybody in the cast, he's also very much in his lane. So he kind of delivers what he always delivers. So I'm sticking to the performance score of 5. Over to the writing, I 1 point less than you.
Sure.
And that's really only because while the plot was tight, I did find myself getting a little lost at certain points, having to think a little harder about, like, wait, what are they doing? Those kind of moments. And that might be a nature of how my brain works, but I thought it was a touch convoluted. They made really good use of the visual effects for their money, but I think perhaps they were trying to do a little too much with some of the story elements. And again, it's only 1 point less, so it doesn't ruin the movie. It's still very much fun and enjoyable for what it is. And also for me, the dialogue overall was pretty rough in many spots. And I take a little bit off for that. So 7, 5, and 5 are where I sit for Hell Comes to Frogtown.
All right, that's one set of scores, and we'll get to the other ones in just a second. All right, so we've done one set of scores. Now it's time to do the others. I think this time, Claude goes first.
Jumping right in here, my scores for Army of the Dead, we have 7 for visuals, 6 for performances, and 5 for writing. Much like Hell Comes to Frogtown, just kind of scaled up. This movie still is considered a fairly small budget film for industry standards and for what the nature of the subject matter usually requires. And this does a lot with what it has to work with. I will say that the nature of the visual effects in this movie, it's not limited to only CGI. There are a fair amount of practical effects work in this film as well, but because the CGI is so modern and so kind of what we're all used to seeing now, where it does feel a little bit pumped out, does feel a little bit generic, and for me it becomes almost fatiguing to my eyes, almost like ruins my interest in continuing to watch the movie from a visual standpoint. It is what it is, and we're all kind of conditioned to that now, but it sticks out for me as well. So, we're not getting past a 7 really because of that. But in other areas, it really makes good use of visual effects, I think. The practical work is really nice, and the things like composition of shots, things like, as you said earlier, the Tig Notaro scenes were like blended into the existing film really nicely.
Yeah.
And 7, it's above our mark. So these films score kind of the same for me in visuals. Performances, I give a 6. It hits right at good. Everybody is doing what they're required to do, and maybe a little bit more in certain characters. Batista is kind of a bit of a veteran at this point for these types of movies and for acting in general, and he has his limits, of course, but he does what he needs to do. He handles emotion better and better, I think, in movies, and that's nice to see. The larger cast, though, it's kind of a standard group of certain character archetypes in these, like, not hitman, but mercenary type group roles. I mean, we've seen it in a lot of movies at this point.
It's a D&D group
Right.
versus zombies.
It's a very much like pick your player type of cast.
Mm-hmm.
And it's apparent everybody was cast for, their ability to portray those well. I thought the actress playing Batista's daughter did an especially decent job of balancing the emotional weight required. And again, Tig Notaro stepping in at the last minute. she's actually a pretty good actress.
Yeah,
I would say. Writing wise, I'm gonna go 5 again because this movie it's not tight. The story is kind of allowed to meander a little bit. Mm-hmm. There are some elements of it that just kind of don't make sense to me, or I kind of wish were different. Dialogue doesn't blow me away, and I'm not certainly coming away quoting any part of this film.
No, that's true.
So I think all those things kind of added up. Just put it at a level of about 5 for me. What say you?
All right, so my scores are visuals 7.5, performances 6.5, and writing 6. To talk about visuals, a little bit higher than Frogtown in terms of my scores, and a little bit higher than your score for this movie. I give it a little bit of credit because they are very competent and well pulled off. It wasn't that long ago where a movie with a budget between 70 and 90 million wouldn't be considered a mid-budget movie. Right, but this movie, again, you mentioned like for the subject matter, for the type of movie it is, to be sort of like a big extravaganza, 70 to 90 million is kind of a limited budget.
Right.
And they do a lot with it. There are a lot of practical effects, which it gets credit for. You've already talked about, the seamless blending of Tig Notaro into these scenes. She never met anybody else working. She never met her co-stars. She was never there. So that's pretty good. The zombie special effects makeup is pretty good. It is mixed well with the CGI elements. But where the visuals get a little bit of a downgrade for me isn't so much in the use of the CGI, it's in the overall design of the set pieces. I mentioned off camera that the marketing for this movie was a lot of neon, bright colors, and exciting because it's got this gimmick where they're in Las Vegas. But in the movie, by the time they get to Las Vegas, it's already been zombie infested for months or years. Yeah. It's been walled off, it's destroyed, so everything is brown. This is a brown movie.
That's right.
And brown and tan. So I would have liked to have seen something where these zombies are they're more of a fresh infestation in a living, breathing Las Vegas. And over the course of the movie, you see the degradation.
I agree.
I would have liked to have seen something like that. So all the special effects in this movie are well done, but the visual aesthetics are a little bit bland. So that's where it gets a little bit of a downgrade. Performances, I give it 6.5. Again, a little bit higher than you. Everybody is doing their job well. You mentioned Batista is doing a good job. He among the pro wrestler actors, he has shown flashes of maybe being the best of them.
Right.
The scene that I mentioned in the basics when he does this one scene in Blade Runner is absolutely far and above, I think, pretty much what anybody else coming from his background has been able to do in a movie. Really well done. So he is accomplished. He can do it. This movie doesn't necessarily ask for too much of that. I mean, there's some sort of like family strife because the daughter character, they're technically estranged.
Yeah.
So there's some of that, but most of this movie is just bombastic action, and he's got to run around and shoot guns and fight zombies, and he manages that. Everybody does, but I think sort of beyond him and his daughter, like you said, most everybody else is cast into an archetype, and they pull off that archetype. So, and everybody does a very competent job at it. I give them a 6.5, a little bit above our sort of level of good. For writing, 6. Again, this score is the same as Frogtown for me, and a little bit higher than your score. But it's a balancing act, because I agree with a lot of what you said. This movie is way too long. It meanders. It goes back and forth between. You've got this seemingly expansive physical space to play with, but they keep coming back to the same small set pieces.
Right.
So they weren't necessarily exploring the space. That could be one way that they sort of hide the limited budget and something like that. Where it's like, we're going to show you all of this, but then we're going to focus on little areas. But again, I think that, so maybe that should go into a conversation about, the visuals. But I think that the writing kind of kept it meandered, and it kept going back to these same places. In terms of dialogue, the dialogue was obviously sort of at a higher level than something like Frogtown. The plot is very similar. You add in a little bit of the family strife, so that's kind of all at a higher level. But the length and like you said, it's not very tight.
Right.
I think that brings it down, so that when you combine the two things, they end up about even for me. Frogtown is kind of not as well written, but it's tighter in terms of its runtime and its narrative. Army of the Dead is maybe a little bit better written, sort of at an academic level.
Sure.
But it is the story, the movie meanders, and sort of it's a little bit self-indulgent with its extended runtime. So final scores 7 for me, 7.5, 6.5, and 6. We're gonna step away one more time. We're gonna do some final tabulations, and we're gonna see who wins. All right, we're back, and we have some final scores. Frogtown 5.83, Army of the Dead 6.33. So Army of the Dead gets the win in a maybe closer than you might expect matchup. So Claude, any final thoughts on our scoring in these two movies?
These are almost exactly where you kind of expect them to be.
Right.
They, I like Frogtown more than I thought I would, and probably a little more than this score reflects. But at the same time, this is a very appropriate score for this movie. And same goes for Army of the Dead. I probably liked it about this much. And it's incredible how close they are when you consider the vast budgetary differences.
Only $70 to $90 million of difference.
Big deal.
Yeah, I agree with you. Again, we've talked about it many times. There's a reason we do our scoring the way we do it, because it doesn't always necessarily reflect our feelings about the movie. Frogtown 5.83 and Army of the Dead 6.33. I probably like Hell Comes to Frogtown more than I like Army of the Dead.
Same.
But here you have the scores showing you that Army of the Dead earns a better score. It's not to say that I don't like Army of the Dead or that I straight up dislike it. I do find that it's a little bit unwieldy.
Yeah.
That's my biggest complaint, and I talked about that in the writing segment. It's just too long.
Yep.
And for what it is, I am not a person that usually complains about long movies. I like to sit and be entertained by a good 3-hour movie. I don't like it when people complain, oh no, a movie's too long, before they even see it. This movie doesn't necessarily make good use of that long runtime. The Army of the Dead, obviously, I'm talking about. Again, Hell Comes to Frogtown is even if the narrative is messy and even if the dialogue is a little bit nonsensical at times, the overall length keeps it within the boundaries of something that makes it fun to watch. And I find Hell Comes to Frogtown to be a more fun watch than Army of the Dead. It's hard to be objective about fun, so that's why it's not in our scoring, but that's why we like to discuss it afterwards. So yeah, I both of these movies I think are worth a watch. In my personal opinion, Hell Comes to Frogtown is probably the only one that I might rewatch someday. I don't know that I'll ever return to Army of the Dead. But that's not to say that it's bad. And obviously, in terms of our scoring, Army of the Dead gets the win.
Agreed. Watch them both, but try not to have more fun watching Hell Comes to Frogtown. I dare you.
Agreed. All right, I guess that's it for this episode of Nerd Bomber vs. Movies. We have a YouTube channel. You must know that because you're already here. We also do a podcast called the Nerd Bomber Podcast. And the best place to find us is on Instagram at NerdBomberPod. And there you'll find links to the podcast, to this show, and to the things that we do individually. I guess that's it. I've been Just Jamie.
I'm your friend Claude.
And until the next battle,
Aloha.
Please deposit litter in trash receptacles as you exit the auditorium. The perfect gift for any occasion, gift certificates are available at the box office. Thanks for visiting with us. Buckle up and drive safely. See you next week.